O ata Māori e kia koutou, no mai, hara mai ki tēnei waanga. Kei te mihi kia rangi nui rawa ko papatua nuku me ki mena atua katoa. He tino mihi kia Owens, mō te tautoko, mō tēnei ipuranga wānanga. Anō reira ki a koutou te whānau o Organics, no mai, hara mai. Ka timata ahau kei raro I te kupu o ngā tupuna he karakia tēnei. E tūnei ki runga I a tātou katoa, te wairua o ngā mātua tupuna. Nā rātou e whakatakoto te ara hei hikoinga mā tātou ngā uri, e whakatōkia o tātou nākau kina tikanga e arataki I a tātou. Kina nākau nui ki te hāpai I a tātou mahi katoa, e roto I te pono, I te tika, I te māramatanga, me te aroha anō o tētihi ki tētihi. E rongo whakiria ki runga kia tīna, hui e, tae ki e. Nō reira ata Māori e. Mōrena whānau, welcome for getting up early. Lovely to see some familiar faces, our Hua Parakore whānau. Lovely to see you, moko. And just welcome to this early morning session. We're going to kick the day off talking about kai atua. So ko wai tēnei, ko taranaki tōku maunga, ko waiwa kai o tōku awa, ko tiati awa me taranaki tūturu o ku iwi, ko Pounamu Skelton tōku ingoa, nō reira. Ko hau te tumu whakarai mō Hua Parakore, kei raro I te maru o Te Waka Kai Ora, nō reira, ata Māori e mōrena. Just like to introduce myself, and then I'll pass it over to my colleague Jessica. So I'm Pounamu. Welcome everybody. I hail from a very small town in Taranaki called Waitara, where I live on a small block of land there, converting it into a Hua Parakore Māori food farm. So looking forward to spending a bit of time with you this morning. I'll just pass it to Jessica. Tēnā koe, Jess.
Tēnā koe Pounamu no I tūwhera te hui. Tēnei te mihi atu ki a koe e hua. Kia koutou katoa, ata Māori e. It's Saturday morning, aren't we committed? We're awesome. Hua Parakore whānau, tino mihi kia koutou. So lovely to start gathering in the organic space as Hua Parakore whānau. It's just, really beautiful. Ko waio, ko au he uri o Ngāi Tahu me Ngāti Huirapa, ka e tahi taha no India tōku mama no Gujarati ia, ko Jessica Hutchings ahau. I am wondering where to start with an introduction. Sorry, Saturday morning, it's a very busy week. So I've had the privilege of working with Te Waka Kai Ora for a couple of decades now. And, the real purpose, for myself and Pounamu and the older members in the movement is really to keep uplifting the Hua Parakore, as a pathway back for whānau Māori to return to whenua Māori with Kaupapa Māori values. And, in the movement of decolonisation and tino rangatiratanga and mana motuhake, nothing makes more sense just to me, and I'm sure to many members of Te Waka Kai Ora. And this is really what's at the heart of our kaupapa, held in the loving hands of wahine Māori, actually, of Māori women holding this kaupapa of Hua Parakore. Mihi atu kia koe moko, kore o e kitia tō kanohi e hoa, engari he mihi atu kia koe. It's just really lovely to have moko with us, who I really want to acknowledge for the many years of service. It's mahi aroha, it's service mahi that we're doing here to uplift Māori organics and recover Aotearoa from agricultural colonisation. So I, along with my wife about 18 months ago, we might share slides, thanks Pete. I passed the screen sharing to Pete this morning. I don't think I can pull that off. So he's going to run the slideshow for us. Thank you. Thanks, Pete. Thank you. So I had the privilege probably a couple of years ago with my wife, Jo, to establish a charitable trust called Papawhakaritorito. And, at the heart of our kaupapa is this kaupapa of Kai Atua. And for those of you on the Hua Parakore journey, you'll know that, when we produce a Hua Parakore product, that product we refer to as Kai Atua. So instead of food that kind of consumes our well-being, or eats us up, food that's not healthy for us, Kai Atua refers to food from the Atua realms, from the realms of deity that's actually fit for us as Atua. And there's many interpretations of how we might explain Kai Atua, but it was something that Percy, our kaumātua, always talked about. If we're able to produce Hua Parakore products in Aotearoa, we're actually producing products that are in accordance with the realms of Ngā Atua. And so, our presentation today is around Kai Atua and just kind of unpacking that a little bit more. It's also to the name of a research project, the Kaupapa Māori research project that Jo and I are leading, called Kai Atua Food for Hope and Wellbeing, where we've talked to about 15 Māori food communities, food leaders around different parts of the motu and Aotearoa, to understand what constitutes a Māori food system at place. So, we often hear our food systems are broken, or we need to do this with our food system, cost of living crisis, Māori need to grow food, all of those things. But actually what we've discovered and unfolded in this mahi rangaho in this research is that a lot of our Māori communities are already doing that. And so, the purpose of our work being Kaupapa Māori researchers is to elevate and lift that up and to shine a light on it through Kaupapa Māori research. So the presentation today is really just kind of stepping you through some of those preliminary findings or ways that we might be thinking about Māori food systems and what constitutes a Māori food system or a Kai Atua food system. And of course, Hua Parakore is right at the centre and the heart of that. Next slide, please, Pete. Thank you. So just a little bit about our trust. So blessed to have Pounamu Mahi with us as well in the trust, as well as Kira. Here's my wife Jo in this picture, and this is taken up at Papawhakaritorito. And the trust has three key purposes. One is to uplift the Hua Parakore, uplift Kai sovereignty, and uplift tino rangatiratanga, just kind of that big broad purpose, which means we can do really anything that we want. So we built that kind of big license into our trust deed. We've never done this. We've never set up a social enterprise. We've never set up a charitable trust. I call myself a recovering academic or recovered academic from a couple of decades in the white institutions of the universities. But I've left lots of other work behind now to put my effort into this. And Jo's left half of her job and gone part-time to put her effort into this. Mainly because what I see in the organic space and in the food space is that there isn't enough infrastructure in terms of Māori food. Like we've got the food banks, we've got all of these things at the bottom of the cliff. But actually we need to start building as Māori our infrastructure and our networks and our organisations which can really support food sovereignty and food security, and of course for us to uplift the Hua Parakore. So our aim is to hopefully create a passive income stream through delivering online courses that we can then siphon that money off to Te Waka Kai Ora, so that there's always pūtea available to pay somebody a salary or half a salary to run the Hua Parakore verification process. That might sound like that's not dreaming very big, we're really aiming just to kind of probably $60,000 or $80,000 every year to be able to fund one or two people's, time to run the Hua Parakore system. But for the last 10 to 15 years, since the Hua Parakore came into Te Ao Marama through the mahi rangaho, through the research project, the thing that's held us up is that we haven't had any funding. So no one, as people know and other people in organics, no one funds organics. We got to find money for it ourselves. The government doesn't blinking fund it. And none of the levies from the agricultural sector in Aotearoa go back into organisations like Te Waka Kai Ora. So we're giving it a go to try and be a social enterprise. So when our courses come out, I'm going to lean into the organic sector, and we're going to ask you guys to help us promote it, to share it across organisations, so it could possibly be professional development. I mean, what's better than wellbeing professional development around how to grow clean kai, how to understand the Hua Parakore, and how to manifest food sovereignty. Next slide, please, Pete. So, you know, I just really want to underscore the importance of the work that underscore the importance of Kaupapa Māori research and learning. Research and storytelling was a massive part of colonisation, you know, stripping away Indigenous knowledge systems all around the world, devaluing them and then replacing them with Western knowledge as the only valid frame and way of knowing. And so it's just always really important, definitely from my standpoint, that we use every opportunity to get in the literature, to change the discourse, and to keep telling our own stories. So this is why this next book we're working on, that's called, it was called Kai Atua, Food for Hope and Wellbeing, but now we've just totally cut that title. It's just going to be called Kai Sovereignty, because that's what our people are doing, you know, on these 15 farms we've talked with whānau, it's just Kai Sovereignty. Mama no iho, keep it nice and simple. Next slide. Just, thanks, Pete. Next, so it's just a bit of a snapshot of our courses that we're running, and I've just mentioned these. They're going to be on a Kajabi platform, and we really hope that this will be a way for us to channel what is a really growing interest in Māori food and Kai sovereignty and Hua Parakore into an online platform where it doesn't put a lot of pressure on a few people to have to keep delivering and to share information, but actually we can grow knowledge and skills through wānanga upurangi. Next slide, please, Pete. Thank you. So this morning, just in terms of our kōrero, Pounamu and I are going to tag team it and, you know, talk a little bit about decolonising methodologies, what we mean by kai atua. Pounamu will talk about the Hua Parakore and the beautiful mahi of Te Waka Kai Ora, and then we'll come to our beautiful deity, our atua of Hiniahuone, and look at ways that we can elevate her and elevate the soil food web if we're thinking about it in Te Ao Pākehā. Yeah, next slide, thank you. So this is an illustration that through our research mahi we have been working with the Kaupapa Māori visual designer Johnson Witihira from IDIA in Wellington on, and it's really a representation of how we're beginning to formulate what a Māori food system looks like. So you can see rangi and papa there right in the middle. You know, and when I look at this, I think of, you know, this notion of as above, as below. And I always think about that in terms of soil, you know, all that diverse biodiversity, all that diversity that we have above the soil in terms of not doing monocropping, but diverse species, we know then creates diverse root structures, diversity in the exudates and in the microbes in the soil. So this as above, as below, you know, it provides an opportunity, this picture, and this is what design work does, it's like a provocation or a gesture to have a conversation as you explain it. You know, I think that's a really lovely way to kind of really help people to think about soil in Hiniahuone. Around the outside of rangi and papa, we have tiki from all around the motu. And so for some of you on the Zoom, you might recognise some of the whakairo in here from your wharenui. But what we were really wanting to do was to make sure that this picture spoke to the diversity across Te Ao Māori, across different iwi and Aotearoa. And then, of course, those tiki are holding a range of traditional and contemporary foods that all make up the Māori food economy, both from wild harvesting, but also too from horticulture, so kiwi fruit, Kāinga Māori in terms of traditional foods, manuka, beads, and then we've got the different types of tools. So down the bottom, you know, the core, that's all good. Might just go back, Pete, thanks. The core, I think there's a timo in there. You can see a kumara in blue. There's a kawa leaf. And so this is what makes up our food system. You know, it's not just the lettuces and the carrots, it's everything. It's the rongoas, the wild foods, it's the cultivated foods, it's the foods for exports, even though it's not really my thing, but it is part of the food system. And of course, then this image is held in what we often describe in Māori resource management terms in a kiuta ki tai frame, you know, from mountains to sea. So it's a whole of landscape, you know, way of approaching it. It's embedded and it's in place. So when people start to say, oh, our food system's broken, where do we need to go to fix it? If we can re-visualize what a Māori food system might look like in contemporary times, then we're starting to provide some of the answers to that, you know, and so lovely that Papatūānuku Marae were awarded the Hua Parakore, you know, award from Te Waka Kai Ora at the Organic Awards this week, because they imbue and embody this in their everyday and what they're doing. You know, they are a food system in the middle of South Auckland, 5 minutes away from the airport. And despite the fact that they're in a massive urban environment, all of this is happening, you know, in situ for them in place. Next slide, thanks, Pete. So decolonising methodologies, you know, this is how the Hua Parakore started, and this is the standpoint that we took on that project, but it's also to the standpoint from which Te Waka Kai Ora works, from which the work of the Trust works, and from how we think about kaiatua. So it's always from an Indigenous standpoint. There's, you know, we are definitely not neutral beings. We have subjectivities all around us, so always challenging that false claim of neutrality that's embedded in Western science, and we hear it all the time in GMOs. And I think it's good to start picking apart this idea that, oh no, science is neutral. It's definitely what Kaupapa Māori does. We take a deliberate standpoint. There's nothing freaking neutral about me if people know me at all, or Pounamu. We've got things to say. And it's a Kaupapa Māori is a decolonising methodologies. And it's, you know, I'm sharing this because research has been a tool of colonisation. And part of the work that we're doing in the Hua Parakore and the organics movement is to decolonise. And then decolonising the academy, well, it's kind of for me, you know, in research work, decolonising all those white spaces of knowledge production to make sure that our stories are elevated. Thanks, Pete. So our food systems really for Māori require us to eat colonisation and whiteness in our everyday. And why do I say that? I say that because for the majority of our people, there is food poverty. They're eating food that's nutritionally empty. They're eating from the commodities market, from the global food system. And, you know, that is not our foodscapes. If we think of that last, you know, a few slides back, how I put up that kaiatua Māori food system. And so the foodscapes that, you know, that bring food through the commodities market into Aotearoa are actually, you know, part of capitalist patriarchy and part of colonisation. And I would describe them as eating whiteness every day on our plate. If we talk about that when I talk about that and use this phrase with Māori communities, they get it. They get that our foodscapes have been colonised, and we're looking for every possible way to turn our communities on, their awareness on, to actually, we've got a lot of work to do around decolonising our foodscapes. Thank you. Next slide, please, Pete. So in terms of kaiatua, you know, these are some of the things that we knew already, but these are some of the things that have emerged from the research. And I think it's nothing, you know, in Kaupapa Māori research, we often don't go in there with a hypothesis that we need to prove, but we go in there kind of with an understanding of the field that we're working in, going, we want to uplift this. So it's just confirmation, you know, and engaging with communities is also to really supports that transformational process that we, that's right at the heart of Kaupapa Māori methodologies. So kaiatua, it's really from that standpoint of tangata whenua, from people of the land. And it's about everything being interconnected, as I mentioned in that other image. It's connected to place, it's tūranga waiwai. It understands food practices, and many people talked with Jo and I about this as a pathway to healing and hope. So hence, the project's called Food for Hope and Wellbeing, but food growing as a rongoa for our hinengaro in terms of mental wellbeing. I was up at Papatūānuku Marae last week, and the thing that they're talking about around, kind of in terms of the COVID and the pandemic, has been the impact on people's well-being and the loneliness of our kaumātua. It just breaks your heart. So they had lots of kaumātua wānanga up there when I was there over the 4 days, just providing space for kaumātua to come together, have a cup of tea, kōrero. I think they were doing mahi rāranga that day. But food is a pathway to healing, and not just healing our physical bodies, but our wairua and our hinengaro as well. It assumes kai atua, the relationship, very clearly makes the relationship between soil and human health. It elevates the voice of diversity. So there is no one food, there is no one way to do Māori food, but we know that there's kaupapa through the Hua Parakore that are really important to elevate. About diversity, but more importantly, it's about small scale. And I go back and I think of the work of people like Rachel Carson, Silent Spring in the 70s, and E.F. Schumacher, Small is Beautiful. And really, small scale organic food farming, small scale Hua Parakore food farming is what is going to feed our people, and is actually what's feeding our people in situ and, place-based. And it's also intergenerational. We have to make decisions for our mokopuna, 7 generations yet to come, not just for our generation or, what we want, later on for us as we get older, but actually what do we want for our mokopuna? It's our responsibility right now to sort out our food system. I've been saying this all week to various groups I've been speaking with. No one is coming to save us. No one is coming to save us around our food systems. It's not like one day we're going to walk into the supermarket and go, oh, that's better. I've been waiting for the supermarket to do a better job. It's going to get worse. And I can, I'm basing that on a recent trip up to Turtle Island, up to the States, where we were there a couple of weeks ago working with women in the Onondaga Nation, working with them, learning and looking and feeling and being in the amazing seed banks, over 300 varieties of corn. But where we were staying, it was described as a food desert because there was not a supermarket in sight. Like, seriously, it's hard to believe, but not a supermarket in the city at all. A whole lot of fast food joints. Options for dinner were literally fried chicken or Dunkin' Donuts. So all fast food off the commodities market. And then they describe that as a food swamp. So what you've got is you're just swamped with fast food. So, if we take America as the future of food, the corporations and the giants that are pushing GMOs and new technologies on us, doesn't look like a very bright future. Also too, we were in a part of upstate New York, which had high rates of deprivation. People of colour predominantly living there, and Indigenous communities. So food deserts and food swamps. We're not going to let that happen in Aotearoa. We're not going to let that happen for Māori communities. So this stage, next slide, thanks Pete. So I think it's a beautiful segue into the Hua Parakore, because when I say we're not going to let this happen in Aotearoa, this is our pathway for not letting it happen in Aotearoa. Hua tu te rākau ki a koe, e Hua Pounamu.
Thank you for bringing all of that rongoa to our ears this morning. And as we start to think about, well, how do we move forward as a Māori community? Well, the work that Te Waka Kai Ora has done over the past 15 years, creating a verification or a korowai for Māori kai producers, and it's called Hua Parakore. So the goal being to create a kai atua, or a pure product, and we're going to talk a little bit about some of those kaupapa or principles now. Next slide, please. So we just want to acknowledge Teresa Reihana for this exquisite art, that really brings us back to the heart of it, you know, our creation stories between Rangi and Papa and all of their children in between, which we are connected to, which is our whakapapa. So I think when we think about kai atua, well then I recall Percy saying it's growing food for your atuatanga, for your god or goddess self. So whatever word you want to use, you know, so it needs to be of a high vibration and a high quality. And so once we start to severe the journey of having toxic food coming into our sacred beings and start to receive kai atua, then it changes, you know, it changes the way that you think, the way that you digest, the way that you're, and hope that your behavior will also be affected, so that we can be really conscious beings, conscious kaitiaki while we're on this place of papa tuanaku. We'll just move to the next one. Thanks, Pete. So Hua Parakore is made up of 6 kaupapa, or 6 principles. And these were collected from a whole lot of interviews with kaumātua around Aotearoa. So the first one, we talk about whakapapa. So when we think about whakapapa, everything has a genealogy, everything has a story. And when I think about whenua, I want to be really understanding the story of the land. You know, what would the land say if I was to be able to hear? What were the stories? What was on this whenua before, you know, I happened to live on it? Who were the people that walked on this land before? What did they grow here on the whenua? And so whakapapa is not only about land and knowing the history of that whenua, acknowledging the original owners, the original kaitiaki. It's also about whakapapa of our kākano, our purapura, or our seed. So ensuring that the purity of seed is maintained, so that we're growing seed from our past, seed from our grandparents, seed from our tupuna, if we're lucky enough to still be able to have it saved. We're learning to save that seed so that the next season we've still got seed. So we're really starting to become more a closed loop cycle and more sovereign by taking care of seed. And then the third aspect to whakapapa is always about yourself. Ko waio, you know, who were the great gardeners in my own whakapapa? And understanding that within our DNA, and this has been my experience and people I've taught over the years, that once you switch it on, suddenly you have a whole lot of knowing inside of you, you know, that you are actually the DNA of your grandparents who were great gardeners in the past. And so it's getting, I think, surrounding yourself in those environments where actually that knowledge is within us. We're just bringing it out through the pathway of Hua Parakore. The next one, wairua, is always an interesting space to come into. And I think about, you know, where we live our everyday life, you know, there's often a lot of chaos and busyness and to-dos and actions. And then when we step into the mara space, your garden, we're stepping into a different realm. We're moving into, often from tūmatoinga, where you're strategic, into rongo mātāne, the atua of peace and healing and hospitality. And so to transfer into a new space, you need to engage our wairua, which is always part of us, but often it's kind of, you know, not so, we don't practice as much as, you know, maybe our grandparents did. So I always see it as a space to move into a place of peace and tranquility and healing. And so you can practice wairua like many ways. Like we began this session by honouring the pathway of our tupuna through our karakia. I was talking to a group yesterday and I thought, okay, as they move out of urban Wellington and into their mara kai, you know, they could create water fountain or something, or maybe a po that depicts you going from one atua to another. So many ways to express the wairua. And actually, I think in wellness, we think about our well-being, it is the wairua that is often missed out when we're moving back towards wellness. So it's a really important aspect. Māramatanga, or the place of enlightenment. This is when it all comes together as a gardener. You know, you learn things that you can never unlearn. And nature helps us to understand bigger concepts. I remember when I first started gardening and I had a basil plant go to seed, and then suddenly there's like 20 little seedlings that just happened because I didn't get involved. And there was a moment of, oh, I see, if I just actually let nature do its thing, then it's going to evolve on its own. So māramatanga is that beautiful space of when the little golden moments, the aha moments drop in, and you've been taught something that now is a gem or a pearl of wisdom, or something that you'll then practice again. Māori is all about that life force. You know, when our soil, hene ahu one, our atua of soil is Māori rich, so when she's been taken care of and we've done no harm to her, and we've been working with puai rākau or composting, then the Māori of the soil is going to be abundant and vibrant. So a perfect place to obviously to grow your food and to produce kai atua. So the act of composting is a perfect example of Māori. You know, the unseen and the seen entities that get to work on our behalf with the natural resources, and actually over time you produce soil. You know, wonderful example of Māori. And I think when we've got plenty of Māori in our own tinana as a human, then, you know, we can think better, we can turn up better, we've got more energy to share with our loved ones. You know, we produce better mahi, and we have more energy for our relationships. So it's really important aspect of Māori. Mana, great examples around the country of that ability to first be sovereign in your own food supply. So being able to feed yourselves, you know, to have enough food for today, tomorrow, probably the next 3 months. And then when you have enough kai yourself, then this beautiful act of service starts to evolve, and you're able to help others, whether it's with all of your seedlings or all of your harvests or your preserves. You know, that's where we want everybody to live, so that people feel whole and they feel like they've got plenty and enough, and that they can start to share with their communities. So I really feel like mana's around your own sovereignty, so that you can then, that ripple effect out to your communities. And then our last kaupapa is around te ao tūroa. So our long-standing world, understanding the dimensions of the environment, you know, the different tohu of each season, understanding what our tupuna used to look for to know when it's time to plant. And they might use a star that rises in the dawn sky, or one of the faces of the moon over the cycle. Or they might read, you know, the forest, like when the flowers, the puawānanga is in flower. All of these things are around us if we just can put on our te ao tūroa glasses. So, you know, that's a layering effect of knowledge, of natural systems, understanding nature, being part of nature, being interconnected, like Jess said earlier. You know, we are the teina, we're the younger, and that we live in te ao tūroa really as a kaitiaki, and I think really as a student of the natural world. So when we bring all of those together, they rise to Hua Parakore. So, you know, not easy, not mama noiho, not just like, oh yeah, I don't spray anymore, but actually really deep contemplation and relationships with the way that we grow kai. We'll just move on to what's next. So our Hua Parakore is, if you can imagine, a korowai, a beautiful korowai that's surrounding you. It takes 3 years to go on the journey. And in that time, you're getting understandings around ngā tikanga or the cultural practices to engage with all of those kaupapa. So we start with a kākano, which is like a seed in year 1, you know, where you're being introduced to all of these kaupapa and you're doing your kai production plan, you're doing some reflection work about your own practices. Come into your 2nd year, which is tipuranga, so you're starting to grow up towards the sun now. And, you know, you're starting to embed some of those principles into your practice. You then get a visit from your regional person and you'll get involved in some regional hui and perhaps some national hui. So you're really starting to feel more confident in your tipuranga year. And then the last year is around, you know, really starting to embed Hua Parakore. And it shows up in the way people speak about it, you know, because I've got to know these kaupapa, and also we hold this beautiful hui where you invite your community to, your kaumātua, you know, your neighbours, the people that have supported you on your 3-year journey to come and listen to your story. So Hua Parakore is about telling your story about your journey and how you've embedded ngā kaupapa, all of the principles, into your mahi, into your mara, into the way of your lifestyle, into the way that you view the earth. And then, you know, it's a beautiful celebration in your 3rd year. And so we're in the middle of all of this at the moment. We've got a lot of people coming through our verification system. It's very exciting. And there's constant learnings going on. And it feels really empowering, you know, for us as Te Waka Kai Ora, but also for our producers. Let's see what's next there, Pete. So some of our superstars, got Whai Geneva here, who's currently our co-chair of Te Waka Kai Ora. She was the 2nd recipient of the Hua Parakore. We'll just go to the next one. Kai Whenua up in Raglan, Kai Waka and his wife, you know, they've got a great story, Seeds of Change. Yep, that they were growing food for the supermarket in Raglan and also educating a lot of their whānau on their whenua. Next one. And many more. So Jessica's farm, Papawhakaritorito is Hua Parakore. Our superstar, Kathy Tate Jamison, was the 1st recipient of Hua Parakore, who obviously, you know, a leader in the field of organic dairy farming and organic yogurt, and many more coming through at the moment. So I think I'll just leave it at that. Tēnā koutou.
Tēnā koe Pounamu, ngā mihi mō tō kōrero aroha e pāna te Hua Parakore. So lovely always to hear you kōrero about the process, and just really want to acknowledge the mahi that you're doing and your tumu whakarai role with the Hua Parakore to really grow the system. It's really exciting. So the Hua Parakore is not only a verification system, it's also too, we have developed it into a Kaupapa Māori soil health framework. So you can use all of those 6 kaupapa to ask questions around soil. And in the book Te Mahi Oni Oni Hua Parakore, we've got that soil health framework in there. But one of the key things, you know, and as you'd all know with an interest in organics and organic farmers and growers in the room, it's all about the soil. For us, we talk about it as elevating the mana of Hini Ahuoni. In what ways can we elevate the mana of Hini Ahuoni? And, you know, when talking with Māori about this kaupapa, of course, we have to acknowledge the impact of agricultural colonisation and the current state of play of where Māori agribusinesses playing in the global commodities market, using sprays and chemical pesticides on the land, and also to, taking tilling approaches and digging into the tinana of Hiniahone and all of her mukapuna, all of those microbes, all of those nematodes and protozoas and bacteria and fungi that all get damaged when we undertake industrial farming practices. So this is a kōrero that is new for many of our people. And so we approach it with a lot of aroha, but also too, we know, as you guys all know, we haven't got time to really muck around changing and pivoting our farming practices. The FAO tell us we've only got 50 harvests left in the world because of global soil degradation. But that plays right into the hands of the GM lobbyists, because they'll be dangling a whole lot of GM technologies in front of us and telling us, well, don't worry about that because we can do vertical farming in these ways and use some GMOs and, GMO drought resistant this and this, that and the other. So this is where the Hua Parakore is so important, because it becomes an anchor or a benchmark or a beacon for us. I come back to that kaupapa of Te Aotearoa in relationship to what I just said about industrial farming practices and GMOs. In what way are those technologies part of the natural cycles of the world? And just what Pounamu said, we are the younger sibling, in the order of nature. And so what is our role then? Definitely not to dominate, and definitely not to be splicing genes and resplicing them. Next slide, please. Thank you. So just in terms of Hiniahone and just, a little bit of growing, because it is Saturday morning. I'm sure some of us are going to get out in the mara. We've really changed our farming and food growing practices at Papawhakaritorito, and predominantly because my wife went on the For the Love of Bees course and was opened up to this whole new world, and then everything became about the microbes. And all of the gardening tools in our shed changed, and we no longer pull weeds, and whenever there's bare soil, is it time to put a cover crop in? And so we're cover cropping everywhere, we're chopping and dropping everywhere. And it's, yesterday we had a group of tauira from the Pūtaiao course at Te Waka up here, and talking with them about this methodology for growing food and why it's so important that we don't disturb, that layer of topsoil, and why we should stop digging and not turning soil over. So for us at Papawhakaritorito, because we have this opportunity living on 12 acres to practice this, it's speaking, we're able to share our kind of trials and our tests, that we're doing here from having practiced it, which feels really puno for us to be able to do that. It's not just talking theory. Next slide, please. So we're very lucky to have some mentors from Kai Cycle, who I always have to acknowledge, because I love our urban food farm in Wellington, and I love the people who are working there, and they're on the Hua Parakore journey as well, and they're so willing to share information. But they really taught us about how we could turn a patch of grass without, not that we spray anyway, but how we could start from grass and then put a cover crop in, and then start a marder bed. So, basically we brush cut this really, really low, and then put breathable weed mat on top of it, so we're not killing the microbes by suffocating them. And then after 3 months, when all the grass was dead, we put a very tiny layer of topsoil and compost on it. We didn't need too much because we had a soil test done. We weren't really deficient in anything because we'd put 500 on the farm for kind of 15 years. Everything was sitting beautifully, but it was all kind of like sleepy. So we needed to do something to wake the microbes up. So hence the cover crop, as above, down below. Now we've got all of this diverse root structure in that cover crop, and so then that's waking up and feeding all the microbes. So we're only supposed to have about 5 varieties of seeds in there, but the whānau turned up and everybody got really excited, so it's probably about 20, when no one's looking. Another handful of buckwheat goes in, and what about this? We'll chuck some marigolds in, and what about that? So I just love it. It's just fabulous. Anyway, next slide. So from this, from that cover crop picture to this one, this is then we were able to get our beds in, 1 metre wide bed, 7 metres long. We've got about 10 of them, and just learning alongside people who are, our urban food farmers actually, and seeing the technologies that they're using with cloches and hoops and and polycropping guilds and succession planting and this, that and the other. It's really lifted our ability to be sovereign on the farm. And so for us being able to do this here, I'm confident now about the growing story that I can share with other Hua Parakore whānau in terms of how we can grow a lot of food in a small way, in a small space, because you could do this in a back garden, in a way which elevates the mana of Hinea Hawani, but also to can enact the Hua Parakore principles. Just, really important. It's important for us anyway that, as researchers and as people in the movement, that we're actually practicing food and farming as well. Next slide, please. Almost there, whānau, a few more slides to go. So I love this quote from Vandana Shiva. I'm just changing tack slightly because this year I had the wonderful opportunity to go to India and to go up to Navdanya Biodiversity Farm with Dr. Shiva to meet with her. And my work over the last kind of 3 decades has intersected with her work on various occasions. And I first met her in person in India 23 years ago with my Indian family at my side. On the other side of my whakapapa, my Indian family were at my side this time 23 years later with me meeting Dr. Shiva as well. Next slide, please. But we were up there filming an 8-part TV series for Kaupapa Māori, which is all on the Hua Parakore. Got a whole episode on Navdanya and a fabulous interview with Dr. Shiva in her seed temple, in her living seed bank, which just was a humbling, moving, overwhelming, quiet, very quiet in myself and my wairua to be in a place like that. So many varieties of ragi, millet, so many varieties of rajma, red kidney beans, yet we only see, very 1 or 2 varieties, probably 1 variety, that makes its way to our table. Her advocacy for the rights of earth democracy, of all living beings, the rights of women, and small-scale food farmers is just relentless. She's been doing it for decades. What really moved me was as we drove up to the farm, there's armed security guards around. Of course they are. She's an Indigenous woman of colour who is an environmental global activist and her life is under constant threat. And so as we do this work, and as Pounamu and I are delivering this, it's really important to remember the activist work of Indigenous women in all of the environmental spaces. Food, food is just one of them, in the lives that have been lost, Indigenous women's lives that have been lost or are constantly under threat because they're speaking out and doing this work. One of the things that I really took away from my kōrero with her was I feel the overwhelm. I'm just, and maybe like many of you do, how do we turn this around? Where do we start? I'm frustrated at Māori agribusiness for not freaking taking an organic pathway. It's sheep and beef, and I know it's agricultural colonisation, but come on, our people are hungry and everything is collapsing at pace. It's like this notion of a perma-crisis, a permanent crisis that's now upon the world. And so I'm sharing this with Dr. Shiva. I was like, so where do we start? Where do we start? What do we do? And she, reaches over to that seed that you can see on the window and she says, 1 seed at a time, 1 seed at a time. And it kind of lifted the weight of it. If we work on this notion that small is beautiful, it's 1 small mara at a time, it's 1 small family whānau food farm, it's 1 marae garden. Although we're trying to counter the big, which she says will always get bigger, that's what it does. That's how it knows success. That is its trajectory for growth. Big always wants to get bigger. Our focus is actually small-scale food farming, and how can we actually then join up those Hua Parakore small-scale food farms to rebuild or reinstate Indigenous foodways or Indigenous food communities again in Aotearoa. So I'm really excited about this series. We have a beautiful episode on Māori that features Pounamu and her whānau and her mahi and Taranaki. A beautiful episode that features Papa Tuanuku Marae, an episode that features biofarm yogurt and what Kathy is doing. And we're almost there with the filming, and then it's post-production. So I think it's Matariki next year by the time it comes out. And I'd love to see this go to a second series, and then to, start to tell the stories of Hua Parakore growers who have just come into the system. Because the first series really reaches back in to connect with some of the kōrero from those people who've been involved in the movement since it's been set up. And I think it's really important to capture that history. So we've got beautiful interviews with kaumātua who won't be with us for much longer. And it's so important that we honour and capture their kōrero so it can be elevated and shared. Next slide, thanks, Pete. Beautiful. Just another image of the living seed temple at Ngavdanya. So we've been blessed to be around Kākano this year, my wife and I, both in Ngavdanya, and then we're just back from the Onondaga Nation and their seed temple as well, which is all about braiding the sweetgrass. And if you follow the trust on Instagram, Papawhakaritorito Trust, do follow us. You can have a look at the reels that we've put together from those stories, because the seed banks on Onondaga Nation are just phenomenal, and over 300 varieties of corn that they're saving, and they're working to explicit instructions from their ancestors that something is coming and they need to go back underground as Indigenous peoples, and they need to take their stores of food and their seeds with them. Now, I don't know what that actually means or how we interpret that, but I'm just listening to that kōrero. Again, it's a seed-saving movement run by women in their 50s and 60s, so it's just interesting. Next slide. Thanks, Pete. So just in summary, in terms of where we've gone on this kōrero and thinking about kai atua, with the Hua Parakore right at the centre in there, that's our pathway for coming to kai atua. We know that Māori food systems are determined by Indigenous people, that they're for Māori by Māori, for Indigenous by Indigenous, driven by Kaupapa Māori values, that they work in the spiritual world, that they're part of Te Wairua. So food is not divorced, from Wairuatanga, but actually we bring and reinstate Wairuatanga back into our food systems. Definitely, it means stepping away from capitalist food systems through becoming producers and connectors to seed, soil and food. As Vandana Shiva says, food sovereignty starts in seed sovereignty, that starts in soil sovereignty. So we really need to make those connections. Connected to place, to tūranga waiwai, deeply connected with whānau, hapu, iwi and hapori community. Kai atua contributes to Māori soil and food sovereignty, uplifting the mana of hini ahone, i ngā wā katoa, ko tērā te mea tino hira. Need to keep uplifting the mana of the soil. We need to keep as Māori having these conversations with our whānau around soil, and we need to stop digging. We need to stop digging into her body. And it's about feeding whānau first, and including feeding our well-being. So if we can't feed our whānau first from the food commodities or the foodstuffs that are being developed or made, then what are we actually doing? And why are we doing this? I know agribusiness is doing it to make money, but this is what really infuriates me about the trajectory of Māori agribusiness. Our people are hungry. We have poverty. We have food poverty in Aotearoa. Yet Māori economy is sending foodstuffs grown on Māori land offshore to participate in capitalist patriarchal economies that do not return benefits back to Indigenous peoples. So for me, I always talk about we need to return Māori foodways back into the loving hands of our communities. But what I see is actually it's back into the loving hands of Indigenous women. Because for the work that we do, Pounamu and I do, and the travels that Joe and I have had, this year, it's really Indigenous women that are leading the forefront of this movement. there's room for everybody in the movement, but I'm just always acknowledging the mahi of mana wahine around the world who are stepping forward and being brave and speaking truth to power, because we really don't have any time to be mucking around and mincing words and being polite about this. So ko tēnei te mihi tino aroha kia koutou. Very early on a Saturday morning, and we're on the Zooms, we're talking about food, we're talking about politics, we're talking about changing things up, and of deep gratitude and aroha for you all for joining us and listening. And maybe some of you, it might have piqued your interest to get on the Te Waka Kai Ora website and have a look at the Hua Parakore system and possibly signing up. I'm going to pass the rako back to Pounamu just for last words and wrapping up. He mihi aroha anō kia koutou.
Tēnā koe, Jessica. Me ki he nui te whakaro e pāna ki te inspirational kōrero. I can feel my heart bursting with hope and well-being for all of us who are privileged to, live in Aotearoa. We have got a chance, whānau, to make the changes one seed at a time. We've heard it from Vandana, we've heard it from Jessica, and just to, today's a good day. Rākau nui, let's get out there, plant some seeds of hope and wellness. Nō reira, I'm going to just finish with a puto karakia and let you all go on to the rest of your day. Thank you to Oans, Lou for organising us, to you, Pete, for being our technical guy, and of course to you, Jessica, for always being able to bring the kaupapa and bring the heart. Kia koutou whānau, tēnō mihi kia koutou, mauri ki runga, mauri ki raro, mauri ki roto, mauri ki waho, mauri ora kia tātou katoa.